The thing is, once you're dead, there's no clearing things up. When you're alive, you still have a chance to prove that you weren't guilty. So I was better off being alive than being dead. 80-year-old William George Heirens uttered these words in an interview. On June 5, 1945, 43-year-old Josephine Ross was found brutally murdered in her apartment. Her stab wounds were wrapped in tape, and her head was wrapped in a skirt. Her apartment appeared very messy, but nothing was missing. No fingerprints of the killer were found at the scene. The only clue obtained was the few strands of black hair tightly clutched in her hand. Initially, this case did not attract much attention and did not even make it into the newspapers. Due to the lack of clues, the murder case remained unsolved. It was not until 6 months later that the Chicago police realized this case was just the beginning. On December 10th, the body of 32-year-old Frances Brown was found in the bathroom of her apartment with a bread knife sticking out of her neck. However, this time, a creepy message was scribbled on the wall of Brown's living room with lipstick. "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." A few days later, local newspapers reported the story of Brown's murder, published photos of the lipstick message, and dubbed the perpetrator the lipstick killer. No one wanted a serial killer in their community. In the following weeks, the city was in a state of panic, waiting for the next terrible crime scene to be discovered. People didn't have to wait long. On the morning of January 7th, 1946, at 7:30 a.m., a man named James Degnan discovered that his 6-year-old daughter, Suzanne, was missing from her bedroom. The panicked man called the police. Soon, investigators found a crumpled ransom note outside the little girl's room window. It read, "Prepare $20,000 and wait for my message. For the girl's safety, do not notify the FBI or the police." Around 7 p.m. that night, based on an anonymous tip, the police found Suzanne's head in a sewer in the neighborhood. Soon after, her legs and torso were also discovered in nearby sewers, and her blood was found in the sewer of a basement laundry room in a nearby apartment building. The coroner pointed out that Suzanne's time of death was probably between 12:30 a.m. and 1 a.m. that day. He believed the killer used a very sharp knife to skillfully dismember the body. Therefore, the killer was either someone in a profession that requires anatomical research or someone with an anatomical background. An ordinary doctor could not have such skilled techniques. The handwriting analyst who examined the crumpled ransom note pointed out that its writing style was similar to sheet music, indicating that the killer might have musical skills. There were witnesses who provided clues in all 3 murder cases. One witness claimed to have seen a dark, black-haired, slim man weighing about 190 pounds near Ross's apartment. Another witness claimed to have seen a man aged between 35 and 40, weighing about 140 pounds, leaving Brown's apartment in a panic shortly after he heard a gunshot. The witness in Suzanne's murder case claimed to have seen a man walking towards the apartment building with a shopping bag. He described him as a man aged about 35, 5 feet 9 inches tall, and weighing 170 pounds. Once again, Chicago was embroiled in a sensational crime. As the public reacted to Suzanne's murder with fear and anger, the pressure on the police increased. They were ordered to catch the killer as soon as possible. However, as the police interrogated hundreds of people and conducted polygraph tests on more than 170 individuals, they repeatedly claimed to have arrested the culprit, only to find after further investigation that they were innocent. One of them was 65-year-old Hector Verberg, who was the janitor of the building where Suzanne lived. Because he frequently visited the scene of Suzanne's death, he was identified as the killer. The police then subjected him to 48 hours of violent interrogation to force him to confess to the murders. They continuously beat him, causing him serious injuries. In addition to Verberg's frequent visits to the crime scene, the ransom note was also a factor used by the police to interrogate him. The police believed that the reason the ransom note was dirty was because it was written by dirty hands. They then forced Verberg's wife to admit that her husband was involved in the murder. However, the police overlooked 2 important points. The coroner confirmed that the killer was almost certainly an experienced doctor or butcher with strong writing skills, but Verberg had no butchering experience and he couldn't even write English properly. Later, when Verberg talked about his experience of being interrogated by the police, he said, "Oh, they hanged me up. They blindfolded me. I can't put up my arms. They are sore. They had handcuffs on me for hours and hours. They threw me in the cell and blindfolded me. They handcuffed my hands behind my back and pulled me up on bars until my toes touched the floor. I go to the hospital. Oh, I am so sick. Any more and I would have confessed to anything." Sidney Sherman, a former Marine who had just been discharged, was a person of interest in the case. The police found some blonde hair behind Suzanne's apartment building, along with a wire that they suspected might have been used to strangle Suzanne. Nearby, they also found a handkerchief which they believed might have been used to gag Suzanne. The handkerchief had a name on it, S. Sherman. Investigators thought the killer had accidentally left it behind. They searched the records and found that Sidney Sherman lived nearby. They wanted to interrogate him, but they discovered that the man had moved away and even quit his job without collecting his salary. So the investigators were convinced that this man was the killer. They conducted a nationwide search and found Sherman in Toledo, Ohio. However, during the interrogation, Sherman denied that the handkerchief was his and explained that he had left Chicago because he had eloped with his girlfriend. The polygraph test confirmed that Sherman was telling the truth. The owner of the handkerchief was eventually identified as Seymour Sherman, who was based in New York and had no idea why his handkerchief was in Chicago. When Suzanne went missing, someone kept making phone calls, claiming to demand a ransom. A local boy named Theodore Campbell provided a clue, saying that Vincent Koslow had killed Suzanne. Koslow lived nearby and had been convicted of armed robbery at the age of 16. Campbell said that Koslow had admitted to kidnapping and killing Suzanne and had asked Campbell to make the ransom calls. However, the polygraph test indicated that neither of the two boys knew the details of the murder, and their information was nothing more than hearsay. Another suspect in the public's eye was a man named Richard Russell Thomas. He was a nurse. Although he lived in Phoenix, Arizona, he was in Chicago when Suzanne was murdered. He was later imprisoned in Arizona for molesting his own daughter. Why did people think Thomas was a suspect? Firstly, his medical skills were sufficient for him to skillfully dissect Suzanne. A handwriting expert also pointed out that there were striking similarities between Thomas's handwriting and that on the ransom note. Although Thomas lived on the south side of Chicago, he also frequently visited a parking lot where Suzanne's arm was found. During the interrogation, he frankly admitted to the murder. However, a man who was caught fleeing from a burglary was identified as the culprit, and Thomas was released. In 1940, to escape his parents' arguments, a 12-year-old boy walked out of his home once again. He wandered aimlessly on the streets, thinking about ways to relieve the pressures of his family life. Once, he stood outside an apartment and stole a dollar bill by reaching through the gap of a chain-locked door. After fleeing, the boy's heart was filled with a sense of thrill. Gradually, he began his career in theft. Within a year, his locker was filled with small amounts of cash, expensive clothes, radios, and firearms. However, no one could have anticipated that a few years later, after being interrogated by the police, the boy would become the culprit behind 3 murders. This boy was William. On June 26, 1946, he planned to take his girlfriend on a date. Initially, he intended to cash a $1,000 savings bond at the post office. Because the amount was large, he brought a revolver for protection. However, when he arrived at the post office, it was already closed. So William prepared to steal again. He stopped in front of an apartment building in the affluent neighborhood where Suzanne had once lived. He then reached his hand into an open apartment door. Just as he had the opportunity to steal something, a tenant discovered him and called the police. The police responded quickly. 2 officers chased William. They drew their pistols, warned the young man, and pulled the trigger. William, frightened by the gunshots, knocked down an officer. The 2 men began to fight. In the end, without a doubt, William was arrested. Over the next 6 days, the police subjected him to brutal interrogation, trying to force him to confess to the 3 murders that had troubled them for so long. While William lay on the ground tending to his injuries, they deprived him of food and sleep and isolated him from his parents, preventing him from meeting a lawyer. During the interrogation, a police officer repeatedly punched William's abdomen. The officer kept talking about the details of the murders, hoping to make William admit to the crimes. On another occasion, 2 psychiatrists, without a search warrant and without the consent of William and his parents, administered a psychiatric drug to William and interrogated him for 3 hours. Subsequently, the police claimed that under the influence of the drug, another personality of William emerged, and he said he had committed the 3 murders. Later, the young man claimed that he did not remember most of that interrogation, and the original police transcript also disappeared. A psychiatrist who participated in the interrogation stated in 1952 that William did not say anything related to the murders. On the 5th day of detention, he was forcibly subjected to a lumbar puncture. A nurse poured ether on William genitals while he was tied to a hospital bed. He was then taken back to the headquarters for a polygraph test, but the police did not announce the results. Meanwhile, the police searched William's room at the university, his parents' home, and the locker he rented at the local train station, all without a search warrant. In the locker, the police found evidence of William's long-term thefts. Apart from that, they did not find anything serious enough to charge him with the murders. Despite the lack of concrete evidence linking him to the murders, such as butchering skills, fingerprints, or handwriting, he was still put on trial. These murder cases also caused a media sensation. He was even publicly declared the culprit before being convicted. A headline read, "The William Story, How He Killed Suzanne Degnan and Two Women." In fact, one of the few pieces of evidence that could tenuously link William to the three murders was the blood-stained fingerprint found on Brown's doorframe. The police compared it with William fingerprints, but it did not match. This is because the FBI standard for a fingerprint match is 12 points of similarity. In addition, when William fingerprints were compared with the two fingerprints and a palm print found on the ransom note, only 9 points matched. So the possibility of William being successfully prosecuted for the murder was slim, as the police's evidence was just partial fingerprints on the ransom note. However, the prosecutor in the area put pressure on the young man. He asked William to sign a plea agreement and persuaded him by saying that if he pleaded guilty, he would only be sentenced to life imprisonment once. William, after experiencing the violent interrogation by the police, was too panic-stricken to start drafting a confession. He said, "As it turned out, the Tribune article was very helpful, as it provided me with a lot of details I didn't know. My attorneys rarely changed anything outright, but I could tell by their faces if I had made a mistake. Or they would say, 'Now, Bill, is that really the way it happened?' Then I would change my story because, obviously, it went against what was known in the Tribune." On July 12, 1946, 17 days after his arrest, William was charged with attempted murder, robbery, 23 counts of burglary, and 3 counts of murder. Despite his insistence on his innocence, on August 7th, he accepted the plea agreement offered by the prosecutor to avoid the electric chair. In the end, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. That night, he attempted to hang himself in his cell. Although he was saved, he said, "Desperation drove me to attempt suicide. Everyone believed I was guilty. If I weren't alive, I felt I could avoid being adjudged guilty by the law and thereby gain some victory. But I wasn't successful even at that. Before I walked into the courtroom, my counsel told me to just enter a plea of guilty and keep my mouth shut afterward. I didn't even have a trial." Later, Josephine Ross's daughter, a victim of the murder, said, "I cannot believe that young William murdered my mother. He just does not fit into the picture of my mother's death. I have looked at all the things William stole, and there was nothing of my mother's among them." In prison, William was a model inmate. In 1972, William became the first prisoner in Illinois history to earn a bachelor's degree. He also engaged in several transactions and helped several inmates obtain their GEDs. In the last years of his life, he was confined to the hospital ward of the minimum security prison at Dixon Correctional Center, suffering from diabetes and confined to a wheelchair. On March 5, 2012, he died in his cell. Because of this case, William's parents divorced and changed their surname, completely severing ties with William. He had been a lonely child since he was young. His father was a day laborer who often spent his meager income socializing with friends, while his mother worked in a bakery. William had to be alone, and then, on the verge of adulthood, he became the culprit of 3 murders, spending his entire life in prison in loneliness.